All right, good morning. As usual, we'll go ahead and do our sign-ins as we're waiting for a few more people to arrive. We'll get started in a minute. While we're waiting, I did want to remind you guys that you guys have a paper due tonight. That's the third essay. And your last quiz is due on the 30th, which is a week from today. And I might have mentioned this last time, but I might get to the point where I have to record an extra lecture. If I run out of time to cover everything in our class meetings, I will record an extra lecture to add as an addendum if necessary. I don't know if it'll come to that, but if I need to do that, I will. And because we only have 2 more class meetings live next week. And if I just need a little more time to cover stuff in chapter 15, I'll record an addendum lecture and I'll let you guys know if that indeed is the case. So I see that most of you guys have signed in. If you haven't already done that, please go ahead and do so, and we will go ahead and continue our exploration of chapter 14 on mental illnesses. All right, so last time we were talking about anxiety disorders, and we ended with a discussion of obsessive compulsive disorder. So just to recap that a little bit, obsessive compulsive disorder is characterized by the presence of both obsessions and compulsions. That's why it's called obsessive compulsive disorder. But in order for that to be the case, you need to have obsessions, which are these recurring intrusive thoughts or urges or obsessions that you can't get out of your head. You feel like the term that's often used is ego dystonic. And I don't think I mentioned that term last time, but ego dystonic is a term meaning that you almost feel like these thoughts are coming from outside of your own mind, as if there were sort of an alien force that were invading you. And you feel like you don't have any control over these obsessions, whether it be about germs or having accidentally killed someone or having left your coffee pot on, whatever. So you can't get this thought out of your head, and then you engage in a ritual that is designed to make the anxiety caused by the obsession go away. And as I said last time, the ritualistic behavior is known as a compulsion, and it maintains itself through a negative reinforcement contingency, whereby when you engage in the compulsive behavior, it makes your anxiety go away. So it's this sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop when you get sort of stuck in this broken record of the mind. And we looked at a video last time, which looked at Howie Mandel, the famous comedian and game show host, who is perhaps the most famous sufferer of obsessive compulsive disorder. And you can see how that disrupts his life and his family's. So that's where we ended last time. Today, I want to finish up our discussion of anxiety disorders first. So we'll talk about PTSD and adjustment disorder. And then the plan is to get through the mood disorders today. And we'll see how far we can make it. We'll probably have to spend a third day on chapter 14 just because there's so many mental illnesses to talk about. And like I said, if I need to, I'll record an extra lecture for you guys just to make sure everything's covered. So let's start with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a mental illness that has gotten a lot of publicity in recent years, particularly with regard to military personnel, because this is a disorder that is characterized by the reliving of traumatic memories. And given that Pensacola State College is a very military-friendly college, we have a number of veterans who attend Pensacola State. And every semester I get at least a handful of veterans. And I know it's a kind of a cliche thing to say, and it sounds trite, but I really do appreciate your service. If you are a veteran, I mean that sincerely. I'm not just saying that because it's the thing to say. It's getting kind of nasty outside. Wind's picking up, looking like it might rain here pretty soon. So at least where I'm at. I see that Chris is comfortably seated outside on a lawn chair, but maybe it's more pleasant where you are. But here in the Ferry Pass area, it's getting kind of, it's picking up a little bit. Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by this sort of reliving of traumatic memories. And because of the fact that Pensacola State is military friendly, I have had a number of students over the years who have confided in me and to other students in my classes that they suffer from PTSD. Roughly 7% of the population will suffer from PTSD at some point in their life. And this is not just a mental illness that affects military personnel and veterans, but it can affect anybody who's been through a particularly traumatic experience. So last period, for example, I had a young lady who opened up about the fact that a few years ago, there was a home invasion in her home, and her little sister had gotten had fallen in with some shady people, and I guess had a falling out with them. And these people came and held her and her little sister at gunpoint in their home because they thought, the people thought that they had drugs in their home, I guess. I don't know the whole story, but basically held them at gunpoint and robbed them. And this student has suffered from PTSD as a result of this experience ever since. So when you experience PTSD, there are nightmares often that go along with it, kind of memories that pop into your head out of nowhere, certain smells or sights or sounds that remind you of the event can trigger an episode, can trigger a panic attack. And often there's this sort of emotional lability that comes with PTSD. And when we say that a person is emotionally labile, that means that they're kind of emotionally unpredictable, that you kind of experience emotions that are sort of all over the place in a short period of time. So it can happen with any sort of traumatic experience. I had another student a few years ago who had been through a car accident, and this was a car accident in which he was driving and he made a mistake while driving, and he accidentally caused this collision with another vehicle, and his wife was killed in the accident very violently, and she died on the scene, and he survived. And he just had massive PTSD over this because of the fact that he was responsible for his wife's death, right? And it was an accident, so I mean, he didn't face any criminal charges as far as I know because it was just an accident. But he relived the memory all the time. He could barely get into a car. He had this massive amount of survivor's guilt, which is often a symptom that you'll see with folks who have PTSD. And I had another, actually, this wasn't a student of mine, this was an acquaintance of mine that a young lady who I grew up with, who I've known for many years, who was sexually assaulted years ago, and she had PTSD, which I think she's kind of made a lot of progress in overcoming in recent years, but she had a serious case of PTSD as a result of having gone through a sexual assault. So this is a condition that can be brought on by any sort of traumatic experience, but we often hear about it in connection with veterans who have seen combat. And I'm just curious, do we have any veterans here? I think we do. I'm pretty sure we have some veterans in this class, if I remember correctly. Anybody in the class seen some combat? You wouldn't care to?
I served, but I never faced combat. I did a flight ops.
James?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Luckily, I never saw combat in the 11 years I served.
Yeah. I think I remember you mentioning that in class, and thank you for your service. Whether you saw combat or not, I genuinely mean that. I came very close to joining the military myself right after 9/11. I think I might have talked about that at one point, but my family talked me out of it. But you know, I've had a lot of students with PTSD over the years, a lot of them veterans, a lot of them for other reasons. But I want to play this TED Talk. It's not a TED Talk, actually. It's a kind of a short 13-minute documentary, actually, on the topic of PTSD among veterans. So in this video, there are going to be some veterans who talk about some of their experiences in combat and who talk about some of their experiences with PTSD. So it's an emotional topic, as you'll see in the video. And if this is, you know, something that bothers you emotionally to watch, I totally understand if you need to excuse yourself from your computer for the next 13 minutes or so while we watch the video. I think it's 13 minutes. I did have one veteran last year who couldn't handle this video, and he had to excuse himself from the classroom while it was playing. So I totally understand if that applies to you. But it's a pretty good informative video on what PTSD is all about and some of the most cutting edge treatments for PTSD. So let's take a look at that now. And if you're watching the recording of this class session, of course, I have to pause the recording at this point because it's a copyrighted video, and I don't want YouTube to take my video down for a copyright infraction. I've learned from that. So if you're watching the recording of the video and you want to see the video that we're all watching right now, please shoot me an email and I'll be glad to send you the link. So guys, if you're watching the recording right now, it just occurred to me that I forgot to resume the recording for the past 15 minutes since the video stopped, and we've talked about a few things beyond PTSD, and I apologize for the segment of the lecture that you've missed. If you want, I can send you a link to my other recording when I did this lecture for another section so you can get all of the lecture. So my apologies. I will go ahead and resume now. Back to the slides. Okay, so a normal person, when I say normal, I mean a non-depressed person, a healthy person who is not depressed, when they have the boss behave rudely to you in the way that I've just described, you know, you're going to find all sorts of rational explanations as to why the boss was short with you, right? But a depressed person is going to have a tendency to take it personally, right? There is going to be a tendency to make the assumption that, oh, it must be because of me somehow. You know, I must be terrible at my job and she must hate me, right? And I must have done something to really deserve this, right? Now, maybe you did screw up on the job, right? And maybe there is some reason why your boss is ticked off at you. But assuming that there's no data that you have to support that, you know, even if you don't even know this to be the case, a depressed person will just automatically assume that it's due to some sort of some sort of fault of their own, that this person is being rude to them, right? So we have this tendency when we're depressed to interpret events in irrationally negative ways. And I'll talk more about that in the chapter on treatment when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is aimed at getting people to think more rationally about these sorts of events so that you don't see as much disruption in mood. Okay, so we should have the slides back up at this point. Let me know if that's not the case. Again, I apologize to the folks who are watching the recording, and there was a good solid 15 minutes there of lecture or more that didn't get recorded. My mistake. So major depressive disorder affects a lot of people, like I said, and 4 or 5 people in this class statistically at some point in your lives will experience a depressive episode. The less common version of depression is what's called persistent depression or persistent depressive disorder. And this is a more mild form of depression. You might think of it as sort of a melancholia that develops, which is like a mild depression. But persistent depressive disorder is a type of depression where it's more mild, but it's longer lasting. And this is not nearly as common as major depressive disorder. It affects 2 to 3% of the population, but it's a little bit more treatment resistant. That's the bad news. But the good news is that it's more mild, right? So it's a more mild form of depression that lasts for at least 2 years. So you have to be depressed for at least 2 years in order to get this diagnosis. Your typical major depressive episode, lasts typically months, right? So this is relatively unusual, but it does happen from time to time. I want to talk a little bit about the gender differences in rates of depression. This is a controversial topic, and the extra credit assignment one of them that we recently had involved watching the Jordan Peterson infamous Kathy Newman interview, as I think Chris astutely pointed out, if we could even call it an interview, because it was mostly just Kathy Newman trying to put words into Jordan Peterson's mouth. Whether or not you agree with Jordan Peterson's positions on these issues, I think we all have to kind of admit that that in that video, Kathy Newman is doing a wonderful job of just kind of trying to put words into his mouth, and it's both entertaining and frustrating to watch. But the reason I included it as an extra credit assignment is because that video has gotten, I think, and it's various. There are a couple of different files of that video available on YouTube, and it's gotten millions of views. So it was controversial, and I thought it was timely to kind of have you guys debate that video. So gender differences are a controversial topic, as we saw in the Jordan Peterson video clip, for those of you who chose to do that extra credit assignment. So when we talk about gender differences, I'm always a little leery that I'm going to piss somebody off, or, but the data are pretty clear that women get diagnosed with depression at twice the rate that men do. And this is something that tends to be relatively cross-cultural too, to some degree. It seems to be a persistent finding. So the question is why, right? Why are women diagnosed with depression at twice the rate of men? Well, there are multiple theories on this. One possible, and I'm not an expert on this, by the way, so I'm not sure what the truth is. But one theory is that men and women deal with stress differently, so that women have a greater tendency to internalize negative feelings, which could mean depression, low self-esteem, depression, etc., whereas men are more likely to externalize negative feelings through engaging in substance abuse or getting involved in violent behavior, etc., and that fundamentally men and women deal with stress differently. That's why you're more likely to see a woman get depressed with depression than a man. That's one theory. Another theory is that maybe just in a lot of cultures, men are socialized to hide their feelings. Men are socialized to kind of grin and bear it. If you're going through emotional difficulties, keep a stiff upper lip. Try to keep it to yourself and deal with your shit, so to speak, right? And that it's unmanly to cry, and it's unmanly to get depressed or to admit being depressed or to seek help. So the theory goes is that men actually get depressed as often as women do, but just don't seek help, and therefore don't get diagnosed as often as women do, right? And maybe it's a little bit of both going on. I really don't know. I'm not an expert, on this, but these are competing theories that you'll hear tossed around about why it is that women get diagnosed with depression so much more often than men do, at twice the rate, like I said. So at this point, I want to talk about the other major mood disorder, bipolar disorder, which many of you have probably heard of as well. It used to be known as manic depressive disorder. That was the old name for it. In the first 3 DSM editions, it was referred to as manic depressive disorder. And then the name was changed when the DSM-4 came out in the 1980s. I believe it was in the 80s that the 4 came out. And the 4 was in place from the 80s through I think through 2000, I want to say early 2000s. The 4 was around for a long time. And we just recently switched to the 5 in recent years. I was trained on the 4. But when the DSM-4 came out, manic depression, the name was changed to bipolar disorder, but it's essentially the same damn thing. So we have two types of bipolar disorder. Now, the defining feature of bipolar disorder is the manic episode. And the manic episode, and I don't have bipolar disorder. So if anyone in the class does, who wants to correct me on what mania is all about, if you've had a manic episode and you feel comfortable speaking up and sharing your experiences on what it's like, I welcome any of you guys to do so here. But the manic episode, as far as my understanding goes, just from studying it academically, is a state of heightened impulsivity and grandiosity. So a person experiencing a manic episode is a person who is having a lot of flights of fancy, a lot of big ideas, right? And they all seem like great ideas. And there's kind of this sense of invincibility that goes along with it, and this heightened degree of impulsivity. Oftentimes, people who are experiencing manic episodes often become hypersexual, meaning that their libidos increase drastically while they're having the manic episode. And I have an acquaintance who is a local artist who has bipolar disorder. And he's in kind of a catch-22 situation, because he tells me that he creates all his best art when he's manic, right? And interestingly enough, bipolar disorder seems to be overrepresented among creative types. Now, not everybody who has bipolar disorder is a creative type, but a lot of folks who have bipolar disorder are creative types. And a lot of creative types have bipolar disorder, it seems.
I think a great example of that, and is Charlie Sheen. Whenever he was on his whole ranting spree, that was just the perfect psychological exemplitude of manic depressive or mania. Anyway.
Yeah. Charlie, are you high right now? Yeah, I'm high right now. I'm high on Charlie Sheen. Oh man, that interview was just epic. I think he ended up getting HIV or something. Who knows how long he had it, but when you live in a polygamist household with a bunch of porn stars, it's not terribly surprising that you might end up with HIV at some point. No judgment to, if we have any porn stars in the class, no moral judgments, but it seems like a lifestyle that would lend itself to a heightened increase in risk of contracting sexually transmitted infections. But yeah, that whole thing was just epic. And sometimes I wonder if Tom Cruise has bipolar disorder as well. Now, I don't know how much of his behavior is rooted in his religious beliefs with Scientology, but I remember one time he went on Oprah and he was jumping up and down on the couch on national TV and, just totally going nuts. Yeah, so that's the kind of behavior that you see with mania, and there's kind of this feeling of invincibility, this hypersexuality, these impulsive behaviors. And my acquaintance I was telling you about, the local artist, when he treats his bipolar disorder, he takes a medication called lithium, and it's very effective at keeping his manic episodes at bay. He's very level-headed when he's on his lithium, and he never has any manic episodes when he's on it. It has some side effects. So you can't drink, for example, while you're on lithium, and he's a beer lover, so that's kind of a problem for him. But if you drink while you're on lithium, it can be really toxic. It can even kill you in some cases. Abdullah wrote, lithium is the most effective treatment. I wrote about it in my paper. Yeah, lithium is extremely effective at treating manic episodes. It does have some nasty side effects, though. So if you're on lithium, you do have to monitor your liver function constantly. And Xavier says there's more to it, but right now she cleans her room a lot. Oh, your mom, your mom has bipolar, and she cleans her room a lot. So is she having a manic episode right now, Xavier? Excessive urination. I didn't know that. I didn't know that about peeing a lot. So apparently having manic episodes makes you pee a lot, right? So I didn't know that. Wow.
Lithium is a very interesting chemical. It is a basic element and it is a mineral. It is naturally found in waters. And I saw a study where they took people from different areas and they measured the lithium area levels in the water, and the areas that did not have any lithium in them, the murder rates were much higher.
That's fascinating. That really is. I would love to see that actually, and I believe you. But that's just. And now I see what Abdullah is saying. You're saying that excessive urination is a side effect of lithium treatment. Okay, I misunderstood there. Yeah, so when my friend is on lithium, he has his manic episodes under control, but the trade-off though is that he says he loses all of his creativity when he's on lithium, and he can't paint, and he basically creates no art. So it's a catch-22 for him, and thankfully, being an artist isn't his only source of income. He's also a massage therapist, and he has some other things that he can fall back on. But when he's on his lithium, he has no creative urges. And so if he wants to create art, he basically has to let himself have manic episodes, which is problematic too, because he's done some really regrettable things. Just to put it mildly, he's done some really regrettable things that he's later come to regret while manic. Like, for example, one time he cheated on his wife while he was having a manic episode, which ultimately led to his marriage ending. And he really loved this person that he was married to. I mean, this is someone he wanted to be with for the rest of his life, but I guess he lost control of his impulses or whatever. And, he cheated on his wife, and it caused the end of his marriage, right? So he's in a catch-22 situation. If he wants to create art, he can't be on his lithium. But if he's not on his lithium, he ends up invariably behaving in really regrettable ways that are just kind of tragic. And so bipolar 1 disorder, we're going to look at the two major types of bipolar disorder here. Bipolar 1 disorder is characterized by simply the presence of severe manic episodes. So with bipolar 1, there's not a depressive element. It's just cycling between a normal mood state and a manic mood state. And the mania, severe mania is the principal component. So the mania is most severe in bipolar 1, but there's no depression in bipolar 1. In bipolar 2, the mania is less severe. In fact, the episodes of mania are what we would refer to as hypomania, which are more mild states of mania. But although the mania states are more mild in bipolar 2, the presence of depression is there in bipolar 2. So with bipolar 2, you have mild mania cycling with severe states of depression. So bipolar 1, there's no depression, but the mania is really severe. With bipolar 2, the mania is more mild, but it cycles with severe states of depression. And those are the two most common types of bipolar disorder. There are a few other less common types. There's a rapid cycling subtype, and I'm not an expert on mental illnesses in general, but I know that bipolar 1 and 2 are the most common types. And like I said, there are a lot of famous artists over the years, and writers too, who have suffered from bipolar disorder. Two of the people on this list I know for a fact were individuals who committed suicide. So Vincent van Gogh, for example, he was believed to have had bipolar disorder. Some folks have argued that he had schizophrenia. And sometimes there's, unless you're really trained, sometimes it can be hard to distinguish someone who has bipolar disorder from someone who has schizophrenia. But there are some notable differences. We'll talk about schizophrenia next time. But Van Gogh, the famous artist, we actually have one of his paintings sprawled on the side of our building, building 14 on campus, The Starry Night. So on one side of the building, there's the girl with the pearl earring, And on the other side, there's The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. And Van Gogh is one of the most famous impressionistic artists of all time. And he was most notorious for having cut off one of his own ears. And he presented it as a gift, I believe, to a cousin, if I'm remembering correctly, as a token of his affection. Someone correct me if the details were different, but I remember reading that Van Gogh cut off his own ear during a manic episode and presented the ear as a gift to a cousin as a token of his affection, right? Hey, I really care about you. Here, have my ear, right? That's just, that is a bizarre way to show your affection for someone, right? But Van Gogh did ultimately end up taking his own life. Jonathan wrote, I think it was a prostitute he and his brother had liked, or some crazy thing like that, right? So maybe it was a love interest. I couldn't remember if it was a love interest or a cousin, or so Jonathan says it was a prostitute. That might be the case. I don't remember the details. Some medicine used to treat schizophrenia can aid in manic episodes. And that's a great point Abdullah makes too. There's so much overlap between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And in fact, that's a good segue into the next slide, because we know that bipolar disorder has a strong genetic component, and it's equally represented among men and women. And some of the same medicines that are used to treat schizophrenia are some of the same medicines that are used to treat bipolar disorder. So there are some interesting overlaps between the two conditions, although there are some differences that are notable, which we'll talk about next time. But bipolar disorder roughly affects 3 to 4% of the population. So that would mean that maybe 1 or 2 people in this class at some point may develop symptoms of bipolar disorder. Probably, I think 1 person would probably be about statistically accurate. And another commonality that bipolar has with schizophrenia is that schizophrenia tends to manifest early in adulthood or late adolescence. So both bipolar and schizophrenia have a tendency to emerge either in the late adolescent years or the young adult years. And the way that their symptoms can be similar is that when you're having a full-blown manic episode, like you would see in bipolar 1, if you become severely manic, you can have what's called mania with psychotic features. And that means that you're so manic that you're actually starting to have delusions. And in some severe cases, even hallucinate, right? And those are some of the hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia, are delusions and hallucinations. So some very severe cases of mania can mimic some of the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia, which we'll talk about next time. So again, like I said, this is our last slide today. Bipolar disorder is extremely heritable, meaning that there's a strong genetic component. So when you say that a condition is heritable, you're saying that it has a strong degree of genetic influence behind it. So we know, for example, that if you have a parent or a sibling who has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that you're much more likely to develop that disorder yourself. So a lot of interesting parallels between the two disorders. And that's why I have them next to each other in the slides. So next time we'll talk about schizophrenia and hopefully get through the rest of this chapter on Tuesday. And that'll give me just Thursday with you guys, our last live lecture to talk about treatment modalities. And I suspect that I might not have all the time that I would like to talk about treatment modalities next Thursday. So there's a high likelihood that I'll end up recording an extra lecture for you guys that you guys can watch on your own time, just to make sure that I have everything covered sufficiently. Okay, so that's it for today. If you didn't sign in, please sign in like Eunice just did. And we will continue with schizophrenia on Tuesday. I hope that everyone's staying safe and healthy. I read recently that we're up to over 400 cases of coronavirus in Escambia County. So, obviously that's not nearly as bad as New York or Miami or some of these other places, but still that's a relatively high amount. So, be careful out there, wear your mask if you can, and, keep social distancing if you can. And I hope that everyone is hanging in there emotionally and doing well, with all of the social isolation. And I will see you guys on Tuesday.
Bye, thank you.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, wait, I have a question actually.
Sure.
So my biological mother has bipolar disorder, and so I have three other siblings. What is the ratio or the possibilities that, like, would it be high for one of us to have it, or?
I don't know, I couldn't tell you precisely, how many of you or your siblings will develop the disorder, but what I can tell you is that it does run in families. So having a parent with the disorder does put you at an increased risk. Now, that's not a guarantee that you're going to develop bipolar disorder. You may go your entire life and never have a manic episode ever in your life, right?
Okay.
But a lot of it, I think, is going to be, looking at that diathesis stress model. I think a lot of it is going to hinge upon, how much stress you subject yourself to, or the world subjects you to. Sometimes we can't control it, but how much significant stress you experience in life, I think it will probably be a significant factor. I'm kind of a fan of the diathesis stress model myself. So I would say that stress is probably going to be something that you want to try to manage well in life. And I think I just saw some lightning, which is good timing. Yep, there's thunder. But
Yeah, it's right over here too.
yeah. So I would, just learn to manage stress well. Maybe if you're not already into some sort of regular physical activity, whether it's jogging or lifting weights or yoga, different things for different people. But that's good for stress management. Maybe take up meditation, not from a religious standpoint, but just purely from a stress management standpoint. Just watch the stress, I'd say, and I'd give the same advice to your siblings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I can relate to some degree because my mother, my mother was a substance abuse addict, and she had some mental health issues of her own. And so knowing that both my mom and dad actually struggled with substance abuse, I really, I'm really careful with things like alcohol. And, I won't say I'll never have another drink again, but, I haven't had a drink in 3 months, right? I just haven't found the need to have a drink, right? Now, maybe someday in the future, I'll be at a friend's birthday party or something and I'll have a beer, but it's very rare that I drink, because I'm aware that substance abuse runs in my family, and so I try to be pretty circumspect about that sort of stuff.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Yep. See you Tuesday.
See ya.
Later.
Hey, Mr. Card, do you still have time to answer a question, or you got to run to your next class?
Sure. Yeah, I've got a couple minutes.
All right. So I read about a hypothesis that grandiose narcissistic personality disorder could actually be a state of near constant mania. And when you think about the symptoms that are present between mania and grandiose narcissistic personality disorder, there's a great deal of alignment. All the grandiosity and I am God and all this kind of stuff. That's what is grandiose narcissistic personality disorder is also a manic episode, or can be described in that way. So, and the interesting thing about that is that the consensus is that grandiose narcissistic personality disorder is not treatable. There's nothing that you can do about it because it is a personality disorder, and that's the way these things are classified. But if it's actually just a near state of constant, if it's actually a state of near constant mania, then that actually is treatable. What do you think?
I've never heard that idea, but it makes sense intuitively. It would be interesting to see, what would happen if you would put, if someone who was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, put them on some lithium or Seroquel or, any one of the various mood stabilizers. And, that's the way you would test that hypothesis. So if that hypothesis is true, that basically narcissism, particular grandiose narcissism, is a state of basically constant mania, then the way you would test that hypothesis is by getting a bunch of people who are diagnosed with that condition and putting them on, you would put them on a mood stabilizer like lithium, and you would take measurements over time to see how it affects those manifestation of those personality traits. And if that hypothesis were true, then you would expect that the mood stabilizer would suppress those behavior patterns. And I think that would be a great way to test it. So I think that would actually make for an interesting clinical trial. And I don't know if that's been done, but I would be really interested to see the results of that.
Which would also mean that the whole way of thinking about personality disorders is wrong that we've come to.
Yeah, so there is a mainstream belief, which I'll mention next time when I talk about the personality disorders, that personality disorders are largely untreatable. And some folks have already begun to challenge this, but there's been sort of a position that's been sort of a mainstream position for many years that if you have a personality disorder, it's basically it's just a part of you, and that there's nothing that can be done. For example, you hear about borderline personality and antisocial personality disorder being impossible to treat, and I think there's evidence that they're difficult to treat, but I don't know. I'm not a clinician, but it is sort of an old school view that's been persistent for a while, that personality disorders are untreatable. But I do know that there are an increasing number of folks who have left that line of thinking. Like I think of Marsha Linehan, for example, who is the guru of the treatment of borderline personality disorder. And she's developed a treatment for borderline personality disorder called dialectical behavior therapy, which has shown a lot of promise. And a lot of folks who've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder have shown some real behavioral improvements after having undergone long-term dialectical behavior therapy, which is a form of behavior therapy that basically teaches you how to manage your emotions and think more rationally. It's sort of a new agey version of CBT.
Right. It's funny how they like they'll go so far with the treatment of certain disorders like autism, like
right.
that, like we're going to cure that, but then like you got other disorders that seem to be just the way the person is, but that you only have that perspective because it's treatment resistant.
Yeah, well, ultimately, I'm a materialist, and I try not to push this position on my students, because I know we have a lot of religious students and students who have strong spiritual beliefs, but I'm of the mainstream position that behavior and emotions, thoughts, everything about the psyche is the result of brain activity. And if we can figure out how to change what the brain is doing, then we can change what people are doing and what people are feeling. So, I'm optimistic that the more we understand about the brain and how it's wired, the better equipped we're going to be able to modify behavior patterns that were previously seen as unmodifiable, right? Of course, the dark side of that is that if we do start to really figure out how to rewire people's brains in significant ways, then there's an ethical Pandora's box there that, once you open it, opens the door to, such, and I'm going off on a red herring here, but, there's an ethical Pandora's box of, deleting people's memories and, brainwashing. And, if you're, let's say you were a despot, and you didn't want anyone to rebel against your regime, you could just undertake a mass undertaking of rewiring people's brains so that they never rebel against you, so there could be a clear dark side to developing these abilities, just like with splitting the atom, right? You split the atom, you can develop clean nuclear power to power millions and millions of homes in a clean way that you could never achieve with coal. Or you can use it to develop thermonuclear weapons and destroy all life on the planet, right? So all technologies ultimately can be used for good or evil. And I kind of went off on a tangent there, but
right. Well, going on what you just said, if you think that everything is 100% material, then talk therapy and dialectic therapy and all these things that you just mentioned wouldn't work, because what we're talking about is thought processes. And that's
Right,
not
but
material.
if you can and I'm not 100% convinced it's all. I mean, I kind of lean in that direction, and
Right.
I kind of go back and forth, but I kind of tilt that way. There are a lot of things about the mind and the brain that we haven't come close to understanding, and maybe, maybe some scientific humility is in order, and acknowledging that we don't understand everything. But I was listening to the Sam Harris podcast. I listen to a lot of Sam Harris, and he's influenced me a little bit. But his ideas on free will, I think, maybe have influenced me a little bit more than I like to acknowledge. But he was talking about this very idea that that if free will doesn't exist and we're just computers made of meat, then then what about the idea of a criminal justice system, and what about the idea of trying to change people's behavior? And the way that he put it, which makes sense to me, but I'm always willing to change my mind, is that that if you verbally input information into someone's brain, you're just a new input, right? And you're a new channel of information, and that information could potentially alter the course that that brain is going to take. Just kind of in a similar way that, like, say, if you installed new software on a computer, the computer doesn't have free will, but it's talk therapy is basically like installing new software, so to speak. Is one way I've heard it looked at. But I don't know. I want to believe in free will. I go back and forth on the topic, but sometimes I don't see. I have trouble seeing where it fits into a purely brain-based view of the world.
I think what you're missing is circular causality. One thing can be the cause of another thing, and that thing can also be the cause of the first thing.
Yeah.
They just go together, right?
Reciprocal determinism.
I don't think that's the word. I don't know exactly what you mean by that, but what I mean is, like, your thoughts control your hormones in your body, and your hormones in your body control your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
They're together. They're one unit all the time. It's always one thing. So it's not purely materialistic, nor is it purely, spiritual. And when I say spiritual, I mean like conscious, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, those two things go hand in hand. They're inseparable.
Right.
That's what I mean by reciprocal causality.
I gotcha. Yeah, and I must confess that we do not understand consciousness, not one bit. Now, we have a strong suspicion, and when I say we, I mean the royal we. Science has a strong suspicion that consciousness is related to things that happen in the brain. But I don't know if you've ever read about the hard problem of consciousness, but it's this question of, why do we need it? Why does there need to be an experience that goes along with the things that the brain does? From a purely philosophical standpoint, there's every reason that there's no reason, rather, for there to be what it's like to be something, right? The brain could do everything that it does in the dark, so to speak. We could respond to stimuli. We could even talk to people. We could even behave in a way that's completely identical to the way that we already behave, but there being no experience that goes along with that stuff. Why is it that the brain doing what it does brings about an experience of what it's like to be that brain, right? And no matter how many neural correlates we can come up with to describe, what happens in the brain during different states of consciousness, ultimately, no amount of that information will ever be able to answer the question of, well, why is there an experience that goes along with that in the first place, right? And the hard problem of consciousness is probably the one philosophical question that consumes me the most. And I'd say the question of free will and the question of consciousness. These are things that I amuse myself with. I read books about this stuff in my spare time, and and I know that I'll never be able to find an answer to these questions that is satisfying, but I just can't help myself.
But
I'm
see that
obsessed by these questions.
I don't understand where your confusion is coming from, though, because the way I see it, like consciousness is an evolutionary thing, right? We evolved the consciousness because we became animals, right? We started moving around. We got to find our food. We got to distinguish things. Okay. So the experience of consciousness is the experience of processing the information that is necessary for our survival.
Right.
Okay. We could not survive. We could not be animals. We could not have changed from a plant-like thing to an animal-like thing without having some sort of consciousness. It's our level of mobility. It's our form of survival that required it. Right.
Yeah, that's a position that's very consistent with, say, someone like William James, the famous functionalist, who was basically the father of evolutionary psychology. And I actually agree with that. I guess what I'm trying to articulate, and maybe not so effectively, is that why is it that there is an experience that goes along with all that information processing, right?
Because it is the processing. The experience is the processing. It's the processing of sensations plus memory equals experience.
Right. So there are folks who make that argument, and by that argument, then you might also come to the conclusion that AIs would be conscious, right? Like computers, or if we were ever to develop a sufficiently sophisticated robot that passed the Turing test, which would mean that it would be a robot that would be able to fool you into thinking that it would be human, that it's human. That's basically what the Turing test is. You might already know that. But that if we ever developed an AI that could pass the Turing test, and some folks say that's already happened, that artificial intelligence, because consciousness is simply the processing of information, it doesn't matter whether it's meat processing the information or whether it's silicon processing the information, that ultimately consciousness is the processing of information. So by that logic, an AI would be a conscious feeling entity that you would have to afford all the rights that an animal or human being would get, right? Because they possess that information processing, so they would be conscious.
I think maybe the answer lies in the distinction between living and non-living things, right? Like living things require values. We require things that are required to sustain our survival. Okay, we have to keep breathing. We have to keep eating, and I think that this is part of what makes the conscious mind, right? Because without those things, there's no reason to desire, there's no reason to fear, there's no reason to have any sort of evaluation of anything if nothing has a relation to you, right? We have relation to those things because they are a relation to our lives, right? And without that relation, there is no emotion, there is no processing of values, what is good for me, what is not good for me, and therefore there is no consciousness.
And by the way, I love this stuff, Chris, and this is the stuff that I geek out about all the time, and I love to have these conversations, and I appreciate, I really love it when I have a student who is into it too. And again, I don't really have a clearly defined position on this, and I go back and forth between various philosophies on this. Honestly, my final answer right now on this is, I don't know, but I sure as hell love to explore this stuff, and it's just infinitely fascinating to me.
Yeah. Let me make one more point, and then I'll let you go. All right. So, let's say you are a robot, all right, and nothing can hurt you, right? Because you don't need anything in particular. You just, you're indestructible. So therefore, you have no relationship to anything. You have no fear. Okay, you have no desire. There's no reason for you to ever do anything, because you can't desire anything, because nothing can be beneficial to you, because you have no relationship to anything in the world. Okay, it's only the necessities of life that give us that relationship to the world, and it's those necessities of life that give us consciousness.
Okay, I actually I see what you're saying, and I think you make a pretty cogent argument. And you know, I think that you would make a damn good philosopher, Chris. So I enjoyed this conversation, and I gotta get on to something else. But I love this stuff, man, and it just delights me when I have students who are as into these questions as I am.
Yeah.
So I think you make a pretty cogent argument there, honestly. So I gotta go, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.
Hi, thank you.
All right, bye, Mr. Carr.
Have a good weekend.
Mr. Carr, I was going to ask you one more. I was going to ask you a question, but I don't want to disturb you guys.
I can't hear you too well. What's that?
I think she has a question about her essay.
Okay. Shoot.
I can't find anything in the library, so can I use the internet article?
Shoot me an email with a link to what you're citing, and I'll take a look at it.
Okay,
Cool.
thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Later.